Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.
Welcome back, everybody. This is the third episode with Lidia Zuin for Future Hacker. This is your host, Maria Taiji. So let's keep going, Lidia. Our first international interviewer at Future Hacker was Dr. Aubrey de Grey. He focused his work on increasing our lifespan through gene editing of diseases that could be avoided. It is a very polemic topic and discussions are needed so we can open paths to studies that can actually help humanity. But also we need to regulate doors that shouldn't get opened at all. So what's your thought on that? Or do you think that all fields should get explored no matter what, and we could maybe adapt ethically and with regulation afterwards?
So one interesting thing about gene editing in terms of reaching longevity and increasing lifespan, actually Aubrey de Grey, I think he works with a woman called Elizabeth Parrish. She founded BioViva in the United States. And I read an interview with her where she said that, well, she wasn't even studying or working with bioengineering, but because she had a child with, I think it's like diabetes or something like that, she wanted to learn all the possibilities available or that could be available in the near future to help her child and ultimately cure her, I think it's his condition. I don't remember if it's a boy or a girl, whatever. Their condition. There's this option, the neutral option in English. But yeah, so she started going to a lot of conferences, even the Sense Research conferences held by Aubrey de Grey. And she created BioViva also to create therapies to increase lifespan. But ultimately, during these processes, she would see also ways of curing other diseases. So it's like these people, like in Humanity Plus and also people from the transhumanist movement, say the disease that is most deadly now, it's not just cancer or whatever, but death. Everyone is going to die. So death and aging is seen as a disease. So it's interesting to see this perspective because in the end you would be curing or treating diseases that happen because we are aging. But if we ultimately, and this is what happened throughout history, right? It's curing and treating some conditions that we had our lifespan increased. So hopefully this is going to happen. And I think it's a great achievement to treat people with conditions and to give them a better life. Because in the end, the problem is not living 100 or 2,000 years. It's living with a good condition. I mean, like having quality of life and being healthy. It doesn't matter if you reach the age of 150, but you're like decaying. You can't really seize your life by its end because you're too sick and too fragile, or too weak. I think it's interesting to see, and I know that Aubrey de Grey talks about that. It's about reaching quality of life and not just simply increasing lifespan. I think it's very exciting. I only get worried about the things we talked before in the first episode, because who is going to be able to access that? Who is going to actually die or don't die? There is this movie very interesting called Elysium. Actually, there's Brazilian actors there, Wagner Moura and Alice Braga. And there's this futuristic scenario where you have the elite living in Elysium and the poor people living in a kind of slum. And there's this woman, she has a child with a condition and she needs to go to this elite city called Elysium because they have like a technology that can cure the condition her child has. So it's basically that. And well, in the end, they need to do a lot of stuff to reach there. So are we going to need this kind of things? Is it going to be this dystopian, or will we have access to a broader network or web or services in terms of healthcare? We see the difference between when we compare the American healthcare and the Brazilian healthcare, for instance. You see that people having COVID-19, the United States have a an enormous bill to be paid afterwards. Whereas here in Brazil, we have public healthcare, also in United Kingdom and so on. So we need to see how we can make this public, how we can make this accessible to everyone at some point. There is always going to be inequality, maybe, hopefully not, but being more realistic, there's always going to be, but it doesn't need to be too intensified, So hopefully we'll develop these technologies and don't make it worse for people in general. Don't increase the gap between people in terms of social, economic, and political inequalities.
Yes, I did see that movie, and it's thinking that way, that's really dystopian side of society, right? So the very, very, very few people are going to have access to all those wonderful technologies, while most of the population will be down there suffering and having no access to all of that. So, let's hope that we can change that from today. So moving forward, there's a lot of discussions around singularity. Do you believe that machines will ever outpace human intelligence and get into a point where humans will no longer be needed?
Well, I think it's kind of logic that we reach the point when machines will be more intelligent, more resistant, more durable than humans. There is this new book by James Lovelock, which is a guy who always talked about nature and climate change and so on. And he published this book called Novacene, in which he basically suggests that we're changing from the Anthropocene to Novacene, which would be this transition between humans living with intelligent machines, and ultimately either we merge with these machines like cyborgs, or we kind of become irrelevant, obsolescent. And in the end, maybe Earth won't be populated by humans anymore, but machines or hybrids of organic bodies and artificial bodies. So it's very interesting because when you see the theories of development, of evolution of species, and also considering theories like the Fermi paradox, they say that the most advanced societies would reach a point in which they become more merged with artificial life, therefore machines. So it's kind of natural to expect that at some time humans won't be anymore just organic, or we would ultimately disappear. It's kind of one of the suppositions, the viewpoints that we see among people studying post-humanism, which is this scenario where humans would be extinct because machines would be more superior than us. But that's kind of survival of the fittest again. If we don't survive to the consequences of the way we damage nature and we caused climate change and so on, maybe we will be extinct, and then just robots or merged creatures, part organic, part inorganic, will be surviving on Earth and outside Earth. So it makes sense. I don't know if we are going to reach this point, but it makes sense for me.
So basically, you are studying all those possible scenarios, right? So, but how do you personally see the wording by 2050, let's say, which is not that far, right? You mentioned in one of your articles that dystopia shouldn't really be considered something bad, but more of an alert to society. And you mentioned how important it is through future studies to speculate about those diverse scenarios, which you've been talking today, and be able to discern from what we'd like to happen and what needs to be avoided. So basically, how could we be going to a more utopian future and, be more inclusive and be using renewable energies and be in a better state than we are today through technologies. So do you think we are listening to those warnings? And do you think we're having enough discussions to get to a more sustainable, inclusive future?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of discussion going on, but there's definitely a bubble of, let's say, this elite that is thinking about this kind of topics. There's going to be an event held by UNESCO in December called Futures Literacy Summit. And basically what they see as an achievement for the next years is spreading the awareness in terms of futures literacy. So it's not just teaching people or presenting people what is future studies, but actually making people understand that they need to think about the future and therefore take the wheel of it and not just being victims of it. So these arguments I bring in terms of dystopia, it's mostly based on this guy I mentioned before, Hans Jonas, this German philosopher. He proposed a discipline called comparative futurology, basically saying that we shouldn't fall for utopias or dystopias. We should actually be more pessimistic and therefore realistic, because if we don't see the risks, if we don't flag the problems we might face in the future, we cannot avoid this future or respond to emergency. And in a way, he says that imagining only optimist and positive scenarios is actually dangerous, because therefore you would be reinforcing status quo, and it's better to be more pessimistic as a means to be prepared for the worst, not that because we want to live this. So dystopias are not actually inspirations, they are actually cautionary tales that we need to see, to analyze and try to strategically think how we can avoid such scenarios. But the thing is, we see subgenres like cyberpunk, which changed from a criticism against the late capitalist system and all the inequalities seen by the authors in the 80s, but it became something aesthetical. It's being sold as franchises in Hollywood. There's a new video game upcoming in December, hopefully, that is about cyberpunk societies, and it became something fetishized instead of being observed as a critic, as criticism against our reality. So in this sense, we reached to the point when Mark Fisher said, well, inspired by Zizek and Jamerson, when they say it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So we need kind of these more dystopian or critical, controversial stories that think the future in a more pessimistic way, so we could actually protect ourselves from that. And in this sense, there's been a lot of people, researchers and projects that are trying to find another means to develop and to carry on with our societies, not necessarily counting on capitalism, for instance. So Aaron Bastani is an English author, and he proposed the so-called fully automated luxury communism, which is basically, in the end, capitalism will destroy itself as much we are developing more and more efficient technologies, and by the end we would be having everything automated, and therefore we would be getting resources from space. It would be like an abundance of riches and materials and so on. So we would definitely reach the point in which we would be living in societies powered by clean, sustainable sources and with a lot of rich that could be shared among everyone, and everyone would be able to live like millionaires live today. Very interesting. I wrote an article about this book, but looking from Hans Jonas' perspective, it's kind of the same narrative that we would find in a more capitalist viewpoint, which is this problem that Harari diagnoses about dataism and how we are changing our faith in God to faith in science and technology. It's not like technology and science are heavenly creations that will save us and spare us from death, disease, and poverty, because we know there's a lot of things happening in the background. Otherwise, we wouldn't have people starving to death. Otherwise, we wouldn't have people dying for diseases that already have vaccine or treatment, let's say in countries in Africa and so on. So it's much more complex than reaching the point of discovering a technology or a scientific method. It's making it available for everyone, and dealing with the political and economic interests behind corporations and also government. So I don't know, I see this very problematic, and that's why I always say that we need to be more careful, more pessimistic, because life is not life's not perfect, and utopia is basically, there's an author who says that you never reach utopia, because utopia is always that mountain in the distance, and when you walk until the distance, the mountain just goes further and further. It's an idea that we will never achieve, and that's why it's dangerous. It will never be good enough, and that's why we need to be more pessimistic in terms of trying to avoid worst case scenarios. And there's also this concept by Kevin Kelly called protopia, which is like the combination of utopia and dystopia, because in the end we live in a world that have more utopian spaces and more dystopian spaces. So we are never going to reach a point in which everything is perfect or everything is ultimately doomed. So I think it's better I agree more with pessimistic philosophers than optimists. So it's my viewpoint.
But you know what? That's actually the basics of risk management, right? You have to draw those different scenarios in order to get prepared for those. I wouldn't even say that it's being pessimistic, but being able to see what could happen ahead of us and have a game plan for that. This is pretty something, and a basic idea, but it's really hard somehow when it comes to future studies, right? Because of all the sci-fi and the entertainment and the movies, people maybe just don't consider that as seriously as they should, right?
Mm-hmm. Actually, there's an article upcoming, unfortunately for now only in Portuguese, but it's talking about these discoveries I made about Hans Jonas' work. And I say that because in terms of profit, it's better for Hollywood and film companies to release titles that are more dystopians, many times not scientifically correct, just to make our brains respond in a way that is engaging and therefore profitable for them. So many movies like Terminator, Alien, or whatever are not scientifically accurate, but they engage us. They are not scientifically correct. And it's not about saying that science fiction needs to be scientifically correct. It's an artistic genre, first of all. But this is being used to colonize our imaginations, right? So we need to be careful on what we believe. And that's why we need to be more literate about futures, technology. That leads us back to the UNESCO Summit on Futures Literacy. And also making future studies more accessible to people, because we have always fallen this temptation of seeing the world either black or white. This is very basic in our dualistic Western culture, but things are much more complicated than that. I like to use science fiction as a means of being didactic, but many times they are not scientifically correct. It's just a tool to address the themes, but it's not necessarily scientifically correct. And in no way science fiction is obligated to foresee the future. Alvin Toffler said in his book, Future Shock, that we should be cautious about anyone who says they can see or predict what is going to happen. So it's not possible. So we shouldn't be asking for this in terms of science fiction works, right? So I think it's basically that.
Lidia, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It was really lovely to have you with us. Do you have any final words for our listeners? It was a truth lecture that you gave us regarding, future studies and all those different scenarios that we could have.
No, I think I talked a lot, and I'm glad that you gave me this opportunity to talk. And hopefully, if anyone has any doubts or want to discuss with me, I'm available on social media. There's just me with this name and a lady that lives in Milan, and which is not me. So it's very easy to reach me out. And I hope to just take this opportunity as a first step to further discussions and contributions. Thank you so much for having me, Maria.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.